Hello, and thank you so much for being here. As you can see, we're not alone today. I've got two new little mohair bears sat on my table, patiently waiting to meet you. They've got so many things to tell you, where they come from, what they're made of, and what their names are. But first, they'd like to tell you where they came from. And to do that, I need to tell you a little story about sea salt. So these are my two latest bears, and they are called Fleur and Lou. Fleur is made with white mohair that's undyed, although I think it's bleached. Lou is made of a beautiful soft grey mohair. And they both have their noses are embroidered with this beautiful, it's sort of a dark grey blue silk, embroidery silk that I found in our local haberdashers. Ironically, in our village there is almost nothing in our village that we currently live in, but there is the most incredible haberdashery shop, and the woman is passionate about using good quality, as much as possible French made materials. So that's right up my street, and I have to be careful going in there because I spend far too long and far too much money in there if I'm not careful. But the inspiration for these two bears came from a desire to try to capture a place in mohair bear. And that place in question is the salt marshes of Guérande, which are very, very close to where we recently got married. Something I love about living in France is a sort of tradition of being really deeply attached to where you come from, in not necessarily, but sometimes a sort of nationalistic or just trying to think, an insular way. French people are very naturally champions of the local produce, the local traditions, the local area, and sometimes it can be a little bit too much and difficult as an outsider, but sometimes it can actually be quite encouraging. Farmers markets, for example, are very common, very normal. They're just part of daily life. We could go to one every day where we live, or in the sort of 20-kilometre radius of where we live. They will typically sell local seasonal food, and again, there's nothing sort of hippie or hipster about it. It's just normal, and I really love that, and I really find that very inspiring, and I sort of drew on that when I was thinking about the bears that I wanted to make for the summer. And I wanted to find a way of capturing where we got married in a bear. And as I talked about in a sort of my mini series for toy making, which is called The Gift of Toy Making, I started keeping a sketchbook whilst I was preparing for our wedding, in which I sort of kept different scraps. And these are some postcards, for example, taken from above of the salt pans. And I love, love, love these colours. I've had these postcards for a very long time because the salt pans of Guérande are somewhere we go fairly regularly. My parents-in-law have their holiday cottage there. And it's a place where the salt is harvested, or I suppose cultivated in centuries-old tradition. They've been doing it for thousands and thousands of years. They have a series of man-made salt pans, which you can just see here. Here's a paludier, so this is a salt worker with his wheelbarrow, and they work with the tide, with the sun, with the wind, and this summer I think they're going to have an absolutely fantastic crop of salt, because the conditions are ideal. It's been a very hot summer, there's quite a lot of wind as well, so the salt is gathered with enormous kind of spade kind of nets, and left to dry by the side of the road. And we often spent time at the holiday cottage in the early autumn, in sort of October, and something we really love to do, again this is the salt pans, we love to cycle in the evening across these ditches or dikes, embankments, not quite sure what you'd call them. It's a beautiful area, although it's a man-made landscape, it's full of wildlife. There's so many different marsh birds. There's also the salt marsh salicorn, which I can't remember how you say in English. It's one of the many plants that grow naturally in salt marshes, and so it's right by the sea. It's where the sort of the land and the sea meet, and as a place, I think I'm particularly drawn to the way the elements are harnessed by man to create something that we can eat. So they harvest two types of salt. So the salt, when it comes out, sort of the main kind of crop of salt is called gros sel, and this is some gros sel here, and it is naturally grey in colour. It's got the natural clay left in it, and I think that's where a lot of the nutriments come from when you're using it in cooking. It's very, very strong, so you don't have to use too much. And again, as I said, at the end of the summer you can drive through the salt marshes or cycle through the salt marshes, and you can buy the salt directly from the producer. They sit by the side of the road with an umbrella, and they have a big pile of salt next to their table, and we can buy it by the kilo. 5 kilos I think is probably what we usually buy. You can get a finer version of the salt which has been milled very slightly, and then there's also the what they call the fleur de sel, so it's the absolute top of the kind of the harvest. It's the finest salt that they have. So this isn't fleur de sel, this is sel fin, but it's even finer than this, and it's crystal white. If I can't really see, but this one is quite grey, this one is a little bit whiter, and then the fleur de sel is very, very white. So I found that I was naturally thinking about the way this product is produced, the way we use it in our daily life. We always have used this salt. Even when we lived in the Pyrenees, we would inevitably go back with a suitcase, with a rucksack full of this salt when we'd spent some time with my parents-in-law. And I wanted to find a way of reflecting that in the wool, and it sort of naturally made me think of the way there's often a bit of a sort of a tension between fine wool and coarser wool, between soft wool and rough wool, itchy wool, etc. And also between the white and the grey, because I find white as a spinner difficult to work with. Actually, I find it quite boring. I know I probably shouldn't. I think I'm more drawn to the coloured sheep, which again might be something to do with me being a bit of a rebel when it comes to to the wool work. But anyway, so this is some Corriedale that I recently spun, and it's a very, well, for me it's a very fine wool. I've woolen spun this, and it's come out beautifully. I'm really, really pleased with the consistency and the ply structure particularly. And that's just an example of some white wool. I also have some that's naturally white Ryland sheep that I spun at the start of our time here, so at the start of the autumn. Again, it's a little bit less white. It's hard to see, but and I spun it. That's more of a worsted weight. That's a DK, a light DK. But I wanted to sort of contrast it with, or I was trying to capture that sort of that fleur de sel, that kind of delicate sort of top. Yeah. I think more so than the softness, just the delicacy, the delicateness of it. And if you haven't realised, fleur de sel means the salt flower, or the flower. Yeah, fleur is flower and salt is sel. So the flower salt flower, flower of the salt. I'm not quite sure. Whereas the gros sel means sort of coarse, big, chunky, and I wanted to reflect that in some wool. So this is some French wool. These skeins are different. They're all from the same big jumble of scoured fleece that I brought from Les Toisons Bretonnes. So I just bought a scoured fleece, or a bag of scoured wool. It was a kilo's worth, and it was all jumbled up. It was I think a little bit over scoured. It was very dry and a bit matted, and it was difficult. I was a bit disappointed with it actually when it arrived, and I was initially thinking of using it as stuffing in a bear, but I actually had to sort of open it up so much that I ended up, I couldn't just use it as it was, as it had been slightly over processed, and so I ended up sort of opening it all up and then putting it through my drum carder. I sorted it into different colours, because it was a big bag of kind of white and black and all the colours in between. And then I tried to get, so this was sort of a majority of darker colours. This was sort of a little bit of a lighter grey, and then these are the sort of very light greys. And I actually ended up finding the sort of the tweediness that came from all the sort of the second cuts and things. It's actually, I'm really pleased with how it came out, because it's the first time I've managed to spin a tweedy yarn. So this was very much an experiment. I would love to eventually make some to sell. It's a blend of Belle-Île and Landes de Bretagne. But just to give you a contrast, this is from the same source, so Les Toisons Bretonnes. I just bought some carded fleece, and it was the only colour, and this came out so much better. This is much more, well, I say better, this is much more uniform. If you've been watching my series of videos called The Gift of Toy Making, you may remember that I've recently been using a sketchbook as one way to record and to gather ideas, inspiration and different materials in the toy making process. And so I thought it might be fun to give you a closer peek inside my sketchbook for this sea salt collection. So here's my sketchbook, a very simple and plain black spiral bound sketchbook. It begins with a meaningful quote, some special words that were shared with me for our wedding. I began with aerial postcards of the Marie Salons. In these first pages I was trying to find the colour palette that I wanted to work with. I was really drawn to this particular postcard. I loved the natural blues and oranges created by the clay and the water, and I tried to find them in handspun and naturally dyed yarn, indigo, madder root. But quite quickly I found myself being drawn back to the natural greys and whites that are also from the salt pans. So I was looking for sources of that around my studio, handspun yarns, scraps of lace, remnants from my wedding dress, wool cloth, linen, and even some handmade felt. I went to my mohair stash and found this light grey and plain white to be the perfect colour. But I also wanted to experiment with texture, so a little mohair yarn. And then there was the question of the paw pads. I wanted to work with natural wool felt, but I wasn't really satisfied with the commercially produced ones, so I started to experiment with my own hand felted. And seeing this bracelet of handmade bobbin lace sewn onto handmade wool felt really sparked off the idea that ended up being on Fleur's paw pads. I'm really glad to have kept this sketchbook of ideas. It's become a real treasure trove of inspiration and also of resources that I've been referring to time and time again throughout the creation of this collection, and I've even been using it in other ways for future projects. But perhaps now it's time to meet the bears. I wanted to try to capture that sort of coarseness as well. So this, I think, very much, this was the jumping board for that sort of capturing that idea of the coarser salt. And then something like this, I have another skein of white yarn that came out much finer as well for that sort of fleur de sel. So I wanted to find a way to translate that into bear making. And so I went through my fabric stash and came up with different samples, and I have some beautiful grey, light grey, and this lovely ivory white, which I must admit I find it difficult to make white bears. It's not something I would naturally gravitate towards. I don't sort of particularly like, well, I find it difficult to know what colour to make their nose, or I sometimes find that the black thread that I tend to favour and then the black eyes is a bit stark. But when I was thinking about trying to make a bear that I knew would be called Fleur, so for fleur de sel, not for flower but fleur de sel, it just naturally came, and she sort of came into being before I'd even made her. So she has the this lovely blue-grey thread, as does her sister, Lou. That was sort of, I wanted to have a kind of a harmonious thread between the two of them. And the other thing that this one has is trying to go back to that idea of delicateness. I wanted to incorporate some lace into the bear, and so I found in our local haberdashery a beautiful roll of French linen, 100% linen lace, which is made in France. And it's just the most beautiful, soft and warm grey with a delicate spider pattern in the lace. And I decided to use it in both the feet pads and the paw pads, sewn over the white felt. As a lace maker, I know that this is what we would call in English the spider. So there's a spider stitch, and this is a stitch that I have done many times as a lace maker, and so I love that there's this beautiful, it would be considered a piece of torchon lace, although this has been made on a machine. It would be considered torchon lace, and it's, yeah, I'm really, really pleased with how she came out. So she's come out as the sort of the lighter, more delicate bear. And you may know or may remember that originally I kind of cracked and went for a sort of a dusky pink embroidered nose, which was inspired by this little scrap of madder dyed silk. But when I finished Lou, who I made second, I just knew that they had to have the same nose. And I unpicked her nose and I gave her a new nose with that blue-grey, and I'm really pleased I did, because I will keep this idea for a future bear, because I think it also goes beautifully with the grey. So Lou is made from the same pattern. She originally was going to be a boy, but then I realised it was a little girl bear, a she bear. She's made from the same pattern, the same mohair, or the grey version of the mohair. And to get that idea of the coarseness, I used some felt that I made myself. So it's a felt scrap from a sheep called La Lacune. Now it's here. This is what's left of that first sample I made, and this is some wool that my friend Florine gave me from her flock of organic sheep that I've visited, that I've met, and it's the kind of wool that is considered useless. Her sheep are raised on the Plateau du Larzac, which is in the sort of Cevennes Midi in the south of France, and it's an area that is very much shaped by the agro-pastoral tradition of keeping the Lacune sheep. And if you know nothing about sheep, you may still know about Roquefort cheese, and that is made with the milk of the sheep. Florine, they don't make Roquefort cheese, they make a different kind of local cheese, but yeah, you may have heard of them that way. And she gave me some wool, some raw fleece that I washed up over the autumn, that I carded, and out of the 100 grams I've got about 80 grams that is spinnable, that I'm going to be spinning up very soon. And the rest, what was sort of not easy for me to card, I ended up having a little go at some wet felting, and it came out beautifully. This has been cut since, so but you can see I was talking earlier on about the evidence of the life of the sheep, and I purposely kept some of the straw and the seeds and different things in the wool when I was wet felting it, because I just think it's important to have that acknowledgement that it comes from an animal that lives out in the element. Not long after I filmed this, there was an unexpected fire at Florine's farm. No people were hurt, but they lost a barn, their milking parlour, and sadly all their sheep. In time, I'm sure they will rebuild their farm, replace their animals, and start working again. But for now, the sting of this loss is still very, very raw. And I still haven't yet been able to bring myself to spin yarn out of this wool from her sheep, which are no longer there. So Lou has got this, has got paw pads from this fleece on her feet. I think that it's perfect for, it's the kind of perfect wool for socks and for felted slippers, so it seemed appropriate to put it there. And I also have very fond memories of the felted slippers that my friend Florine lent me when we went to visit, so I wanted Lou to have felted slippers. And she's called Lou because I was struggling to think of an appropriate name for her in the sort of salt kind of vibe. I nearly called her Sally, which just, I don't know, makes me think of salt. But then I remembered that in Breton the word for grey is louette, and that made me think of Lou, and I think Lou is a lovely name, so it could be a boy bear, but I think it's very much a girl bear. And looking at the back of the bear, I've just remembered, so on both bears I've now started putting, well, firstly I've started putting labels on my bears. This is a new addition, and I've also started putting a woolen heart on their bottoms. So I've blanket stitched on using the same thread as the nose, and this one is that white wool from the Lacoon sheep, and this is some grey wool, which is actually from again a sample of felt that I made. It's from a Ryland sheep, and it's from the same flock as this wool came from. So these two skeins of yarn I spun up at the start of the autumn, and they come from a local to where I'm from in Dorset, very small holding, where the lady who works under the name Wildcraft, or Wildcraft UK, she keeps Shetland sheep and Ryland sheep, and I am a big fan of her wool, and I have spun a lot of wool from her, a lot of the Ryland, and I have some Shetland actually on my bobbins at the moment, from her flock too. And I made a little sample of wool felt in the few days before I got married, because I wanted some wool from where I had grown up, and the small holding is located, I think, about 15-20 minutes from where I grew up, in a lovely lovely town called Wimborne. And so I made a little bracelet onto which I stitched some bobbin lace, just to come back to the lace that I'd made when I was 16 years old. So this was my sort of garter, if you will, using this precious scrap. It's actually one of the first pieces of lace I ever made. I was taught by a lovely French, well, actually she's Swiss, but I was taught in France how to make lace in Grenoble, or near to Grenoble in the mountains of the Chartreuse, by a Swiss friend of my parents called Heidi, and she taught me in French how to make bobbin lace. And the sort of amusing memory is I was about 14 or 15 when she did that, and when I later took my one of my first French oral examinations for the exams we take when we're 16, which are called GCSEs in the UK, I spent most of my time in French talking in French about bobbin lace making, which is la dentelle au fuseau. And I think the examiner, who was actually French, my French teacher, was a bit bemused, because I think I was using vocabulary that she'd never even heard of, even though she was French. So, and yeah, making that, so that sort of combination of the rough and the delicateness, that was also one of the sparks for combining the wool felt with the lace. There's some examples of some paw pads. That was me just trying out the paw pads, and I also have a little sample of a paw pad with lace on. So that was one that didn't quite go according to plan, but I thought I'd keep it to go in my sketchbook. So that is the story of Lou and Fleur, and I just wanted to share that because I wanted to show the different ways that I think my different disciplines as a maker, be they knitting, spinning, felt making, natural dyeing, toy making, they all just really do sort of communicate with one another. They inform one another. One thing leads me to the next, and then it leads me back, and then it leads me further, and then it leads me to another point, and then it leads me back again. And I really love that I can have these sort of internal dialogues with my making, with the materials themselves, and the way they just, they help me to evolve as a maker, as a creative, and also just in my personal life as a consumer, and as well as a craftsperson. So yeah. Thank you for being here. I'm really grateful for all of you who've reached out to me to encourage me in what I'm doing, and particularly to encourage my sort of slow approach and the way I do things. And it's really uplifting and really wonderful, and I'm really grateful to be part of this community. So thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon. Take care. Bye bye.